We're always hearing about like these huge global events
Mm.
and these economic things happening,
Mm.
shifts and stuff.
Yeah.
And it can be, honestly, it can be a little overwhelming
Yeah.
trying to like connect the dots and see how it all fits together.
Right, right.
So today we're going to do a deep dive into a book that offers a pretty thought-provoking and sometimes really surprising way to look at all these connections.
Oh, cool.
We're going to be talking about Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism.
How interesting. I've heard of that.
Have you?
Yeah.
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 So think of this deep dive as more of us like unpacking a complex argument,
Okay.
not just giving you like a basic book summary or something.
I see. Yeah. So like digging deeper,
Yeah, exactly.
more analysis, less just, the surface level.
Totally. So
Yeah.
Klein's work, it goes way beyond just documenting, a bunch of bad things happening.
Right.
It actually puts forward a specific thesis. And that thesis is that times of like really deep societal crisis,
Mm-hmm.
those are often followed by, people deliberately imposing some pretty radical free market economic policies.
Oh, wow. So it's not just like a coincidence.
Right. It's about understanding a particular logic that's kind of at work during these times that seems so chaotic.
I see. Yeah. Like there's a method to the madness kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the Shock Doctrine, it's a really substantial book.
Okay.
Like it's based on a ton of research.
Yeah.
A lot of case studies.
Mm-hmm.
And the core idea, as the title suggests, is that in the aftermath of major shocks.
Okay.
So this could be like a devastating natural disaster.
Huh.
It could be some sort of violent political upheaval,
All right.
or even the widespread disorientation that happens after
Yeah.
like a big terrorist attack.
Yeah, I think this makes sense.
You often see this calculated effort to kind of push through these big and often really unpopular free market reforms.
Mm.
And the theory behind this is that a society that's still reeling from some kind of shock, they're less likely to like resist these changes.
Oh, interesting. Because they're kind of like vulnerable, right?
Exactly.
They're not really in a position to fight back or think critically about what's happening.
Exactly. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
again, Klein isn't just saying, "Oh, this is a pattern."
Yeah.
She's arguing that these moments of vulnerability, they're actually taken advantage of.
Right.
They're almost seen as like opportunities.
Wow. That's pretty cynical.
Yeah.
It also kind of makes sense in a like strategic way, I guess.
Right. And that's what makes the book so
Yeah.
kind of unsettling,
Uh-huh.
but also, thought-provoking.
Right. Yeah.
So our goal in this deep dive, what we're going to try to do is
Yeah.
examine some of the most compelling examples that she lays out in the book
Okay.
and really kind of dissect the mechanisms that she identifies.
I see.
We want to give you a framework for understanding how these world crises
Yeah.
and these economic policies, how they intersect.
I thought it was really useful, actually.
Yeah.
Because I think, like you said, it's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day news cycle and not really see the big picture.
Exactly.
Just having like a framework to analyze these things
Yes.
would be super helpful.
Exactly. So to kind of get into this, let's start by looking at this this really unsettling concept that Klein explores early on in the book.
Okay.
And it's this idea of the mind as a blank slate.
Hmm.
So she talks about the work of Dr. Ewan Cameron
Oh, yeah.
at McGill University back in the 1950s.
Okay.
And for folks who might not know, what exactly was he researching?
Right.
And what was he hoping to achieve with these experiments?
So Cameron, he was really focused on this idea of deep patterning.
Deep patterning. Okay.
Yeah. And his experiments, they were actually partly funded by the CIA.
Wow.
Yeah. And what he did was he subjected people to like extreme sensory deprivation
Oh, wow.
and also sensory overload.
That sounds intense.
It was really intense. And his goal, as he saw it, was to strip away
Yeah.
existing mental frameworks to basically regress people to a state where they're super suggestible.
Okay.
You know, like a psychological blank slate.
Oh, wow. So almost like wiping the hard drive, and starting over.
Exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
like erasing their personality and,
Yeah.
and their way of thinking. And actually, he himself said that if you do this sensory deprivation for long enough,
Yeah.
it actually induces what he called the primary symptoms of schizophrenia.
Oh, wow. So he's basically trying to break people down mentally
Yeah,
to make them more malleable.
exactly. That was the whole point.
That's really disturbing. And this wasn't like some isolated thing.
Right.
It was
No.
like some weird scientist off in a lab somewhere.
No.
Klein, she makes a direct connection between this and the development of interrogation techniques.
Yeah, that's right. She connects it to the CIA's Kubark manual.
Kubark manual. Okay.
Yeah, and that manual, it also talked about using sensory deprivation and overload.
Really?
Yeah, as ways to break people down during interrogation.
Oh, wow. So this was like officially sanctioned.
Yeah, it was. And there's this historian, Alfred McCoy, who, he's done a lot of research on CIA interrogation practices. And he describes this manual's approach as a revolution in the cruel science of pain.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. And he specifically traces it back to Cameron's work at McGill.
Wow.
So, yeah, these weren't just like theoretical exercises. They had very real and very dark applications.
So we're talking about methods that are specifically designed to, like, psychologically shock individuals
Right.
into a state where they're easier to control.
Yeah, exactly. Make them more pliable, more susceptible to suggestion.
So how does this connect to the bigger, shock doctrine idea
Right.
on a societal level?
Yeah, that's the key question, right?
Yeah.
Like, is this just an analogy,
Right.
or is there a more direct link?
Yep.
And Klein, she argues that it's not just an analogy.
But-
She says that just like Cameron was trying to create this state of like extreme suggestibility in an individual
Right.
through psychological shock.
Okay.
She says that large-scale crises, like things that happen to a whole society, they can do something similar.
Okay.
They can induce a similar state of disorientation
Yeah.
and vulnerability.
But on a collective level.
Right, yeah. Like, think about what happens after a major disaster,
Right.
or some other kind of sudden traumatic event.
There's this period where, like, the normal rules
Right.
and the way people think, it gets disrupted.
Yeah.
And Klein uses the example of 9/11.
Okay.
The trauma of that,
Uh-huh.
the suddenness of it.
Right.
It created this huge sense of shock and uncertainty
Yeah, totally.
across the U.S.
Yeah.
And during that time, there was this really rapid shift
Okay.
in the public discourse.
Yeah.
And people were suddenly willing to accept these, like, really significant changes.
Yep.
Even changes that, under normal circumstances, they might have resisted.
Yeah, yeah. Because it's almost like the collective psyche is like stunned.
Right.
And so that creates this opening
Yeah.
for new policies to come in.
Right. And sometimes those policies are pretty radical.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a pretty compelling parallel,
Yeah.
but it's also pretty unsettling.
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
So now Klein introduces the key figures behind a lot of these radical free market policies.
Yeah. And that's Milton Friedman.
Yeah.
And the Chicago School of Economics.
The Chicago School, right.
So for someone who might not be, like, super familiar with their work,
Uh-huh.
what were the kind of the fundamental principles that guided their thinking?
So the big thing about Friedman and the Chicago School was their belief in free markets.
Right.
Like really, really free markets. Unfettered, as they would say.
Okay.
And they were very, very suspicious of government intervention in the economy.
Okay.
They thought that the government should be as small as possible
Okay.
and that the market should be left to do its own thing.
I see.
And their argument was that this was not just like a good idea, it was essential
Okay.
for economic prosperity
Okay.
and individual liberty.
Interesting. So they're connecting it to, like, freedom as well.
Yes, absolutely. They saw it as like a moral issue, that government intervention was like inherently bad and that it infringed on people's freedom. So they wanted to get rid of things like price controls,
Okay.
minimum wages,
Right.
state-owned enterprises, anything like that. They saw those as distortions that were messing up the natural efficiency of the market. And Friedman's big goal, as Klein interprets it, was to get back to what he called a natural state of economic health.
Interesting. Natural? Okay.
Yeah. And he thought you could do that by removing all these, like, interferences.
I see.
So it wasn't just about tweaking the system.
Right.
It was about, like, a fundamental restructuring.
Okay. So they didn't see any value in like a mixed economy.
No, not really.
Where you have like some capitalist principles,
right,
but also some government regulation.
Yeah, they saw those mixed economies as like ugly hodgepodges.
Oh, wow.
They thought they were inherently flawed and inefficient.
So their ultimate goal wasn't just to like reform things a little bit. They wanted a complete transformation to a pure laissez-faire system.
Yeah, exactly.
So that puts them very much at odds with the Keynesian economic thinking.
Right.
That's popular after World War II.
Yeah, which was much more about like government intervention.
Right. Using the government to, manage the economy. Yeah. Try to prevent recessions, things like that.
Exactly.
And the Chicago school, they positioned themselves as this like radical alternative.
Yeah, they were the outsiders. And they were like waiting for their chance.
Waiting for their chance to put their ideas into practice.
Yeah.
And they weren't content to just like write papers and give lectures.
They wanted to see their ideas implemented in the real world.
Exactly. So tell me about the Chile Project.
Oh, yeah, the Chile Project. So that's a really important example of how the Chicago school wanted to like go beyond just talking about things and actually like put their ideas into action. Okay. So starting in the 1950s.
They got funding from places like the Ford Foundation.
Okay.
And they set up this program at the University of Chicago to train Chilean economists in their specific brand of free market economics.
Interesting.
Yeah. And these graduates, they became known as the Chicago Boys.
The Chicago Boys.
Yeah. And they were supposed to be like the leaders who would guide Chile towards this neoliberal future. It was like a very deliberate attempt to like export their ideology.
Oh, wow. So it was like an intellectual movement?
Yeah, absolutely.
That they were trying to spread.
Yeah.
And Chile was like their testing ground.
In a way, yeah.
But this initial investment in training, these economists, it didn't immediately lead to like policy changes.
No, it didn't.
Because you had the election of Salvador Allende. Yeah. In 1970.
Right.
And he was a socialist.
He was. And that was a big setback for the Chicago school. Yeah, because his whole platform was about like nationalizing industries.
Yeah, the opposite of what they wanted.
Right, exactly. Expanding social programs.
Right.
So it was like a major obstacle to their long-term plans.
Yeah, it was a big roadblock.
But then something happened that that created a very different opportunity.
A much more violent and coercive opportunity.
Yeah. And that brings us to one of the most disturbing examples in the book. Yeah. Which is the implementation of what Klein calls shock therapy in Chile.
Right.
Under Pinochet.
Under Pinochet, yeah.
So can you walk me through like the key events and the policies that were put in place?
So the big turning point was the military coup.
Right.
On September 11, 1973.
Okay.
Led by General Augusto Pinochet.
Right.
And under the cover of like extreme political violence, suppression of dissent, and just this like profound sense of national shock. Right. The Chicago Boys were brought in. Oh, wow. So they were like waiting in the wings.
Yeah, they were ready.
Wow.
They had this whole plan.
Really?
Yeah, it was called the BRIC.
The BRIC.
This like detailed blueprint.
Oh, wow.
For Chile's economic transformation.
Wow. So they had this all ready to go?
Yeah, they were just waiting for the right moment.
And what were the core components of this BRIC document?
Okay, so the BRIC, it basically laid out this like radical program of privatization. Okay. They wanted to privatize pretty much everything that the state owned.
Wow.
They wanted to cut public spending drastically across all these social programs.
Right.
And they wanted to deregulate the economy.
Okay. So like less rules, less oversight.
Exactly.
And what was the immediate impact of all this?
So the immediate impact was like a really rapid and dramatic concentration of wealth
Oh, wow.
and a huge increase in inequality.
And Orlando Letelier, who was Allende's former defense minister, he was assassinated
Oh, wow.
in exile.
Oh, my God.
But before he died, he described
Okay.
how like billions of dollars were just transferred
Sure.
from like regular workers
Uh-huh.
to capitalists
Wow.
and large landowners.
So just like a massive transfer of wealth
Yeah.
to the elite.
To the already wealthy, yeah.
But Klein also points out that Chile under Pinochet,
Right.
it wasn't like a textbook example of a totally hands-off free market.
That's right.
Right.
It wasn't a pure free market.
Like the state still played a pretty big role.
A very big role, yeah.
In kind of facilitating this transformation.
Yeah, so they talked a lot about free markets and, minimal state intervention.
Uh-huh.
But the reality was quite different.
Yeah.
The regime, they used state power to, like, crush labor unions,
Oh, wow.
to privatize assets,
Okay.
and they even bailed out a lot of these newly privatized companies
Wow.
when they ran into trouble.
So it's like this selective use of the state
Right.
to kind of benefit
Yeah.
a select few.
A small elite, yeah.
And then there's the terror aspect of the Pinochet regime.
Right.
The disappearances,
Yeah.
the torture,
The fear.
the climate of fear.
Yeah.
And Klein argues that this wasn't just like an unfortunate side effect
No.
of the coup.
She argues it was integral
Right.
to implementing those economic policies.
Yeah, she makes this really disturbing argument
Yeah.
that the terror was actually essential for creating this climate of fear
Yeah.
that basically silenced any opposition
Right.
to these really unpopular changes.
Exactly. People were too afraid to speak out,
Yeah.
too afraid to resist.
And it's a sobering fact that the U.S.
Yeah.
actually provided training and support
Right.
to Pinochet's military.
Yeah. So there was like this geopolitical dimension to it as well.
So the shock of the coup itself,
Yeah.
followed by this like sustained terror,
Right.
that created the space
Yeah.
for the economic shock therapy to be imposed.
Exactly.
And this brings us back to that quote from Milton Friedman
Yeah.
about, only a crisis
Right.
produces real change.
Yeah, that's like the core of the shock doctrine.
Right.
This idea that moments of crisis, whether they're real or manufactured,
Right.
they create these windows of opportunity
Well, yeah.
to implement changes that you couldn't do
Right.
under normal circumstances.
Because people are like distracted,
Right.
disoriented.
They're not paying attention.
Yeah, and Klein illustrates this with a whole bunch of examples
Yeah.
beyond Chile.
Right.
So let's look at the Falklands War
Okay.
and Margaret Thatcher in Britain.
So the Falklands War, that was in 1982. And it was mainly like a geopolitical conflict, but it gave Thatcher this huge surge in popularity
Okay.
at a time when her economic policies were like really unpopular.
Really?
Yeah, because there was a lot of unemployment
Yep.
and inflation,
Right.
and people were not happy.
Hmm.
But the war, it kind of like changed everything.
Okay.
It created this like nationalistic fervor,
Right.
this sense of crisis.
Yeah.
And Thatcher, she used that
Oh, wow.
to consolidate her power
Okay.
and push through these reforms that she wanted to do anyway.
So she kind of used the war
Yeah.
as a cover
In a way, yeah.
to implement her agenda.
Exactly.
And then you have the case of Bolivia
Yeah.
and its hyperinflation crisis in the 80s.
Mid-80s, yeah.
So what happened there?
So Bolivia, they're facing this like crippling hyperinflation,
Oh, wow.
which was like really threatening the country.
Okay.
And the government under
Yeah.
President Paz, they decided to implement this shock therapy program.
Oh, okay.
And they were guided by this economist, Jeffrey Sachs.
Jeffrey Sachs, okay.
Yeah. And what they did was they imposed all these like really severe austerity measures
Right.
all of a sudden,
Wow.
like boom, all at once.
So like a real shock
Yeah, a real shock
to the system.
to the system. And they also declared a state of siege,
Oh, wow.
and they suppressed labor unions
Okay.
to prevent any like pushback
Mm.
from the people.
Wow. So it was a pretty authoritarian approach
Yeah,
to dealing with this crisis.
it was.
And Klein also talks about how the IMF,
Right.
the International Monetary Fund,
Yeah.
played a big role in spreading this shock therapy approach,
Yeah, they were a major force.
especially during the debt crises
Right.
of the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
So how did that work?
So basically what happened was you had all these countries
Uh-huh.
that were in debt, and they needed loans from the IMF.
Right.
And the IMF, they said, okay, we'll give you the loans,
Uh-huh.
but you have to implement these structural adjustment programs.
Structural adjustment programs.
And those programs, they were basically shock therapy,
Oh, wow.
privatization,
Okay.
deregulation,
Right.
cuts to government spending, all the same stuff.
Wow.
And there was this guy, Davison Boodhoo, who worked at the IMF,
Okay.
and he became a whistleblower.
Really?
Yeah, he said that the IMF was, like, manipulating data
Oh, wow.
and pushing policies that he thought were really harmful
Wow.
to these countries.
So even something that seems like positive,
Right.
like the transition away from communism in Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
that wasn't immune to this logic either,
No, it wasn't.
according to Klein.
No.
So let's take, for example, Poland.
So Poland, they had this really rapid transition
Okay.
from communism
Uh-huh.
in the late 80s, early 90s. And a lot of people celebrated that
Yeah, of course.
as this, like, triumph of democracy and freedom.
Right.
But it also involved this, like, really quick
Okay.
and often painful
Yeah.
implementation of free market reforms.
Mhm.
And it happened during this time of, like, economic crisis
Right.
and political disorientation.
So people were kind of like vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. And there was this promise
Okay.
that if they just embraced these reforms,
Yeah.
everything would be great.
Right.
That would have this, like, prosperous capitalist system.
Yeah.
But that promise, it didn't really turn out to be true
Mm.
for a lot of people.
And Klein contrasts that with China,
Right.
where they also introduced free market policies,
Yeah.
but they did it alongside this like suppression of
Yeah.
democratic movements.
So it was a different kind of, like, authoritarian approach
Yeah, exactly.
to the same goal.
So far we've talked about how crises have been used. Expert speaker.